right. So, as mentioned before, there was going to be an interview to this project on Black History Month, and that's where we are now. And I just want to inform you that this material here is closed and will be removed after the project is done, so you will not be able to access it. So, now's your chance. All right, so here's my friend who would like to share some thoughts with you. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so nice to have you here. And just to get started, I want to know what's your age?
I'm around 30 years old.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And where do you live right now?
I live in Lund. Yeah, currently studying at Lund University.
Nice. And so that is what you do for a living, and you've been here for.
I've been here for a little over a year now, maybe a year and a few months.
Hmm. And where do you come from?
I'm from the US. I am from the East Coast.
East Coast.
Yes.
All right. And your, how did it look like where you lived? Do you have any siblings, big family, smaller family?
Yeah. I have an average sized family. Well, I don't know what average would be in Sweden, but yeah, I have older brother and sister, and growing up, I'm from a rural area, and yeah, I grew up in the suburbs. So yeah, my childhood was very quiet, but also quite fun. Lots of open space to play and enjoy being a child.
All right. Um, so now on this theme that we're talking about, depend in the U.S. where you come from, did you ever feel that you were treated differently because of the color of your skin?
Uh, yes, I have. I think there were moments that happened to me when I was very young, like in elementary school and middle school, where I really didn't, know or understand uh, discrimination. But I remember a few years back thinking about my very first encounter with racism, and I think I was maybe about, I don't know, 7 years old, and I had visited one of my friends' homes. He invited me to his house to just hang out over the weekend, and he was at the time my best friend, and so yeah, we played all day, and I guess I was a funny little kid, and I didn't really realize it, but um, something that you know stuck in my mind. I don't remember too many of the details of that day, but uh, the father of my friend, I had said something, and then the father said, that's a funny little nigger boy." And at the time, at that age, I really didn't know what that meant. But then uh, when I went back home and I, told my mom about, my time with my friend, and it's like, "Oh, I had so much fun, mom. Like, yeah, it was like we did this, we did that." And then I was like, "Yeah, the parents even liked me. The dad said I was a funny little nigger boy." And my mom just screamed, and she just, hugged me, started crying, and she said that you will never ever go to that place ever again. And at the time, I didn't realize it. I had no idea what was happening, and but not until I was much older, yeah, had I just recalled that moment, and I thought, wow, I can only imagine like the fear um, that my parents had for their child, being at a place where, you know, something bad could have happened to me. So, but yeah, and I'm sure, or I don't know if you know the history of that word, yeah, nigger, but it's uh, absolutely the most offensive word that can be used or said about a black person, because it's incredibly degrading, and it links and connects back to, you know, times of slavery when we were treated as property, not as human beings. And yeah, so anytime that word is used or in a very offensive way, then it's, I don't know, it makes myself and every other African American person, you know, feel like they're not human. And yeah, but at that age, at that time, I didn't realize it. But yeah, of course, I definitely know the impact and the feeling of it now.
I can totally understand that. Thank you so much for sharing that story. And then you kind of answered it a little bit, but if you could add, maybe if you want to add something, depending on where you came from, were you treated differently?
Mm.
Both that you came from a African American family, but also did your area of living affect anything?
Um, I think where I come from, and still many American towns and cities, they're racially segregated. You know, you have minorities living in certain parts of town, and yeah, and where I lived, the part of town that I lived, it was in the black area. So, you know, many of my cousins and other relatives lived in the area, and it's, yeah, it's much more of a I guess a tighter knit community, and that's because historically where I was from, you know, that was yeah, it was a racially segregated area of the town. So, and you know, generations later, African Americans still live there. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And that's something that we can see in, that you guys in class might see as well if we look on how it looks in Sweden. That people with non Swedish backgrounds usually don't live with like those with completely Swedish backgrounds. That's actually common here as well. You might not have noticed, but in every city and in every town, you find different areas that look completely different, and that can be just a couple of 100 meters that separates those areas from each other. And but I want to keep asking just a couple of more questions, and the one I'm looking at here is, now that you're here in Sweden,
Mm.
how does it feel to be here? Any similarities to back in the US or differences?
That's a pretty tough question. I think uh, because I've only been here for a little over a year, it's very difficult for me to say, you know, that I truly know Sweden. I think from just the surface level, maybe through observation. I've noticed some similarities, and I guess just as you mentioned before, I guess, you know, different areas where there's more minorities that live in a particular area of town. I noticed it here in Lund and also in Malmö, and but otherwise, you know, after coming to Sweden, everyone has been so kind and friendly to me. That my experience has been absolutely great so far. Uh, the weather is very different from where I'm from. um, I've really enjoyed the experience so far. So, and I'm lucky to have Johannes as a friend. So,
Lucky to have you.
yeah. So, yes, many similarities and many differences, but yeah, overall, it's been such a really nice experience so far.
And just to like wrap this up with like a final question here, would you say that African American history is being ignored by those who aren't African American?
Um, I would have to say yes. Um, in the United States, the issue and the topic of race is still quite sensitive, and acknowledging the history of the United States, though we've made a lot of progress as far as improving the rights of many different minorities and marginalized groups in the United States, but it's the legacy of slavery and the history of the African American struggle from slavery until today. Um, it's still not discussed that much. Um, and even in our schools, our textbooks, when talking about slavery and other events throughout American history or the modern American history, um, there's very small sections of African American histories and and influential African Americans throughout modern American history, and it's not acknowledged enough. And I just recall just being in school that we learned so much about European history and world history, and we talked about European settlers going to the U.S. And settling upon this new land and building a great country and freeing themselves from the British and becoming an independent, strong nation. And they talk about this, very glorious history, but not much is really discussed about, how they were able to build this legacy, and how important African Americans were in helping to build the country. So yeah, I just remember there were not many things that were mentioned about my people and usually just much more of the tragic incidents and then skipping to the civil rights movement and then talking about Martin Luther King, who everyone knows, but I think they only really acknowledge that part of the history, this more positive part, and not really discussing, why we had those problems, why Black people today or African Americans today are still having difficulties obtaining some kind of good life. So and these real topics and real questions aren't really asked or discussed amongst uh, all types and colors and races within the U.S. So yeah, there's still a lot of work and progress that needs to be made in the U.S. as far as having honest discussions about feelings and history because it still affects us today.
Thank you so much for sharing all of this. That is really, really kind of you.
Yeah.
And I hope you who listen to this really take the time to listen carefully because We will both discuss it and just try to think yourself into like how it is to be in a situation where you can feel so much injustice towards you, not just in like today's society, but that has been going on for several hundreds of years, and that is something that we will be that we'll keep looking at. So I'll see you guys on Monday. See you soon.
Bye.